The 100-year-old man collapsed to his knees right there on stage, clutching his military cap against his chest, as 15,000 people watched in stunned silence. Security rushed forward, but André Rieu raised his hand and did something that would change everything forever. What happened next brought the entire Boston Common concert to a complete standstill, and when you hear what this forgotten war hero whispered into that microphone, you'll understand why grown men were sobbing uncontrollably in the audience. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and how old you are. Drop your city and age in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these amazing human stories that remind us what truly matters in life. 7 days earlier, Zephyr Blackwood shuffled through the historic cobblestone streets of Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood. At 100 years old, he was nearly invisible among the bustling crowds of tourists and locals. A World War II veteran who had lived in silence for decades without recognition, without fanfare, without anyone seeming to remember what he had sacrificed. His weathered cane tapped a steady rhythm on the old brick sidewalks as he carefully navigated through the Back Bay district. It was a warm June day, and sunlight sparkled off the Charles River in the distance, but Zephyr felt none of that warmth. His world had grown cold through years of loneliness and buried memories. "Grandpa!" a voice called behind him. Zephyr turned slowly to see his granddaughter Lirelei Blackwood hurrying toward him, her auburn hair flowing in the breeze. She was 30 years old, full of energy and life, everything he no longer was. "Zephyr, what are you doing here?" she asked with her gentle voice, worn thin by nearly a century of use. "I was looking for you. You didn't answer your phone." She reached his side and took his arm, looking concerned at his exhaustion. "Grandpa, you should have told me you were going for a walk. It's too hot for this kind of exertion." "My time is over," Zephyr mumbled, a phrase he repeated so often that Lirelei almost expected it automatically from his lips. "I walk where I want to walk." She sighed, knowing there was no point in arguing. Instead, she pulled an envelope from her bag. "I have something for you." "What is it?" "Tickets for André Rieu's concert, tomorrow evening on Boston Common. I thought maybe it would be good for you to get out." Zephyr looked at the envelope as if it were a strange object. "Music? Why would I go to music?" "Because you used to love music," Lirelei said softly. "Grandma always told me how you played piano before the war, how you used to play records on that old gramophone. Why did you stop?" Zephyr looked away, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance that only he could see. "Because music is joy, and I lost the right to joy." "Grandpa, that's not true." "You weren't there," he interrupted, his voice suddenly harder. "You didn't see what I saw. You didn't do what I had to do." Lirelei felt her throat tighten. This was the closest her grandfather had ever come to talking about the war. Normally, he shut down completely when the subject came up. "Tell me then," she said quietly. "Tell me what happened." But Zephyr shook his head. "Some things are better forgotten." They walked in silence until they reached a small cafe where Zephyr drank coffee every day. It was a modest establishment, run by an old friend who had also survived the war, though that friend had died 6 years ago, and now it was run by his son. "A cup of coffee, Grandpa?" Lirelei asked. "Yes, and then I'm going home." They went inside and sat by the window. Lirelei ordered 2 coffees, while Zephyr stared outside, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. "Grandpa," Lirelei tried again about the concert. "I'm not going." "But why not? It's free. I got complimentary tickets from my work and it's just a few hours. It would be good for you to be around people." Zephyr turned to her, and for the first time that day, Lirelei saw tears in his eyes. "Because I don't deserve to enjoy myself, Lirelei. Not after what I've done. Not after who I lost." "You fought for our freedom," she said passionately. "You're a hero." "Heroes die," Zephyr said bitterly. "I'm just someone who survived." The coffee came and they drank in silence, but Lirelei didn't give up. She knew her grandfather well enough to know that beneath that hard exterior was a man who was suffering, not physical pain, but the pain of unspoken memories and unprocessed trauma. "Grandpa," she said after a long silence, "if you won't go for yourself, go for me. Please, I want to spend time with you, and who knows, maybe the music will do you good." Zephyr looked at her, and she saw the internal struggle in his eyes. Finally, he nodded slowly. One concert, and then no more questions. No more questions, Lyrily promised, though they both knew it was a lie. 2 days later, Lyrily and Zephyr stood in the crowd on Boston Common, surrounded by thousands of people who had come for André Rieu's annual summer concert. The park was decorated with lights and flowers, and the atmosphere was festive and joyful. But Zephyr felt no joy. While the crowd around him laughed and talked, he felt isolated, trapped in his own thoughts. "Are you okay?" Lyrily asked worriedly, looking at his pale face. "I shouldn't have come," he said. But before Lyrily could answer, the music began. The Johann Strauss Orchestra took the stage, followed by André Rieu himself, making his usual energetic entrance. The crowd cheered, but Zephyr stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the stage where the musicians were tuning their instruments. And then they began to play. The first notes of a familiar waltz filled the park, and Zephyr felt something break in his chest. It was as if a door he had kept closed for 75 years had suddenly opened, and all the memories he had tried to bury came flooding out. He saw himself as a 25-year-old soldier, listening to the same music on a radio in a destroyed house in France. He remembered the face of his best friend Montgomery, who had stood beside him, both still believing they would survive the war. But Montgomery hadn't survived, and neither had so many others. "Grandpa," Lyrily's voice sounded far away. "Grandpa, you're crying." Zephyr touched his face and indeed felt tears. He hadn't cried in decades, but now he couldn't stop. "I have to leave," he said desperately. "I can't do this." But the music held him captive. It was as if every note, every melody was a thread pulling him toward the stage. And before Lyrily could react, before he even realized what he was doing, Zephyr Blackwood began walking forward. His legs, which were normally so weak he could barely walk without rest breaks, now carried him with a strength he hadn't felt in years. He pushed through the crowd, his cane firm in his hand, his eyes fixed on André Rieu standing on the stage. "Grandpa, wait!" Lyrily called, trying to keep up with him, but he didn't hear her. The security guards by the stage saw him approaching and began moving forward. But something in Zephyr's bearing, his determination, his desperation, made them hesitate. And then the impossible happened. Zephyr Blackwood, 100 years old and barely able to walk without help, climbed the steps to the stage. The orchestra continued playing, unaware of what was happening at the edge of the stage. Only a few musicians in the back rows noticed the old man struggling up the stairs, his body shaking from the effort, but his determination unwavering. Sterling Vance, the stage manager, saw what was happening from his position backstage. He immediately grabbed his walkie-talkie. "Security to stage right, we have an incident." 3 security guards began running forward, their faces stern and professional. This kind of thing happened sometimes with overly enthusiastic fans who wanted to storm the stage. And it was their job to handle it quickly and discreetly. But when they got closer and really saw Zephyr, his old military cap, his trembling hands, the tears streaming down his wrinkled face, they stopped. There was something in his eyes, something that made them hesitate. One guard still reached for Zephyr's arm. "Sir, you can't be here. You need to come with me." Zephyr turned to him, and the look he gave the young man made him take a step back. It wasn't an angry look, not an aggressive stance. It was the look of someone who had looked death in the eye and no longer knew fear. "Don't touch me," Zephyr said, his voice surprisingly strong. "Not until I've done what I came to do." In the audience, Lyrily had finally reached the stairs, her heart pounding with fear and confusion. "Please," she cried to the guard. "That's my grandfather. He's a war veteran. He means no harm." But the guards weren't listening. Their training told them that no one, regardless of age or status, should be on stage unauthorized during a live performance. Meanwhile, Zephyr had reached the center of the stage. The music was still playing. The orchestra members were so well trained that they kept playing despite the commotion, but several of them were now looking, wondering what was happening. André Rieu stood with his back to the incident, playing his violin and addressing the crowd. He only noticed something was wrong when he felt a change in the energy of the audience. The cheering became quieter, replaced by murmurs and confusion. He turned around and saw Zephyr standing just a few meters away from him. The old man had removed his military cap and held it pressed against his chest, his other hand leaning on his cane. For a moment, André froze. This was unplanned, unexpected, and potentially dangerous. His first instinct was to let the security guards do their job. But then he really looked at the man, at the tears, at the cap, at the posture of someone making a final act of courage. And André Rieu, who was born 30 years after the war but was raised with stories of resistance and liberation, immediately understood who this man was. He raised his hand, not in aggression, but in a gesture of stop. "Wait," he said to the security guards who were now close. "Leave him alone." The music hesitated. Clarinets and violins lost their place in the melody. André gestured to the conductor to stop, and slowly, like a great machine winding down, the orchestra fell silent. The silence that followed was deafening. Thousands of people on Boston Common held their breath, not knowing what was happening but feeling it was important. Zephyr stood there, trembling but upright, his eyes closed as if whispering a prayer. Memories flowed through him, memories he had suppressed for 75 years. He saw Montgomery before him, laughing despite the mud and blood. He saw the little French girl they had rescued from a burning house, her eyes wide with fear. He saw the comrade who had died in his arms, whispering for his mother. "Why am I here?" Zephyr mumbled, more to himself than to anyone else. "Why did I survive and they didn't?" André walked slowly toward him, his violin still in his hand but now useless. He came close enough to touch the old man, but didn't. Instead, he waited. "Sir," André said softly, respectfully, "may I ask who you are?" Zephyr opened his eyes and looked directly at André. "I am nobody," he said. "I'm a forgotten soldier who has lived too long." "You are not," André said firmly. "You're here for a reason. Please tell us why." The audience leaned forward. Thousands of people tensely waiting for what would come. Phones were held above heads, cameras rolled, but no one made a sound. Zephyr tried to speak, but his throat was tight. He looked out over the sea of faces, young and old, American and foreign, all looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. "I fought here," he finally managed to say, "in these streets for your freedom. But nobody remembers. Nobody remembers us." André felt tears prick his own eyes. He knew about World War II, had heard the stories of liberation and resistance, but he had never stood face to face with someone who had actually lived through it. "We remember," André said, his voice now amplified by his microphone so the entire park could hear. "America remembers, and tonight we will honor you as you should have been honored 75 years ago." But Zephyr shook his head. "You don't understand. I don't deserve honor. I did things." His voice broke, and he almost fell to his knees. André grabbed his arm to support him, gesturing for a chair to be quickly brought forward. "Come, sit," André said kindly, "and tell us, if you can, what you want us to know." Zephyr sat but didn't look up. Instead, he stared at his hands, old, wrinkled hands that had once held a rifle, that had taken lives and tried to save lives. "I was 25, he began, his voice barely audible despite the microphone André now held close. "Younger than most of you here, and I thought I was indestructible." The audience listened in perfect silence as Zephyr's story slowly came out. Painfully, agonizingly, like pulling teeth. He told about his unit, about the men who had become his brothers. He told about liberating towns, about the joy and the sorrow. He told about friends who died, about civilians he couldn't save, about choices he had to make that no 25-year-old should ever have to make. "And then it was over," he said, his voice now a little stronger. "The war ended and we went home." But there was no home anymore, not really. Everything had changed and we had changed. He looked up at André, then out at the audience. "You celebrate freedom. You hold concerts and have fun. And that's good. That's what we fought for. But sometimes I wonder if anyone remembers what it cost." André let the words hang in the air, knowing they carried more weight than any music he had ever played. Then, softly, he began to speak. "Sir, may I know your name?" "Zephyr," the old man said. "Zephyr Blackwood." "Zephyr Blackwood," André repeated, speaking to the audience. "A man who fought for this city, for this country, for the freedom we now take for granted. He turned to the orchestra. "I think we owe him something." Sterling Vance stood backstage, his heart pounding. This was his concert to manage, his responsibility to keep everything running smoothly. And now there was an old man on stage who had brought the entire show to a halt. He grabbed his walkie-talkie again. "André, we need to continue. The audience is getting restless." But André ignored him. Instead, he looked out over the crowd, his usual showman persona replaced by something more authentic, something deeper. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across Boston Common, "what you are witnessing now is not part of our planned show. This is something much more important." The murmuring in the audience grew. Some people started whispering. Others looked at their phones, searching for an explanation of what was happening. Was this real, or was it a staged stunt? But Lyra Lay knew it was real. She stood at the edge of the stage, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her grandfather. She had never seen him so vulnerable, never seen him so open. "Grandpa," she whispered, though he was too far away to hear her. "It's okay, you're safe now." On stage, Zephyr tried to stand, but his legs refused to carry him. André placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stay seated. There's no hurry." "I shouldn't have come," Zephyr said, shame now mixed with his emotion. "This was a mistake. I'm disrupting your concert. I'm ruining everything." "You're not ruining anything," André interrupted. "You're reminding us of what's important." A voice from the audience called out, "Let him speak." Others took it up. "Yes, we want to hear. Tell your story." But not everyone was so understanding. Some tourists began shifting uncomfortably, looking toward the exits. They had come for entertainment, not for a history lesson. A man in the back rows shouted, "We paid for music, not for this." The comment cut through the air like a knife. Zephyr heard it and winced. "See," he said to André, "nobody wants to hear from an old man still living in the past." But then, something remarkable happened. A middle-aged woman in the front rows stood up. "My father fought too," she said, her voice clear in the silence. "He died before I could tell him how proud I was of him." Another voice joined in. "My grandfather was in the resistance. He never talked about it." Slowly, more people began sharing their stories. Family members of veterans, people who had lived through the war themselves as children, younger generations who finally wanted to understand what their ancestors had endured. Boston Common transformed from a concert audience into a community united by shared history and collective memory. Jessica Morton, a local journalist covering the concert for the regional newspaper, lowered her camera and began frantically taking notes. This was no longer a regular concert review. This was something that would make national news. She saw how André Rieu, one of the world's most successful entertainers, was sacrificing his own show for something bigger. She saw how an old man who had lived in silence was suddenly the center of thousands of people's attention, and she realized she was witnessing something rare in this modern age, a moment of true, unfiltered human connection. On stage, Zephyr tried to control his emotions. "I don't know what to say," he told André. "Say what you feel," André replied simply. Zephyr took a deep breath and looked out over the audience. So many faces, so many lives made possible by what he and his comrades had done, but also so much ignorance about what it had cost. "Freedom isn't free," he began, his voice now stronger. "It's paid for with blood, with lives, with young men who should have become old men but never did." The audience listened breathlessly. "My best friend Montgomery was 24 when he died," Zephyr continued. "He wanted to be a teacher. He had plans, dreams. But he's buried in a field in France. And nobody but his family remembers his name." André felt the weight of those words. He thought about his own life, the fame, the success, the opportunities, all made possible by people like Zephyr and Montgomery. "Mr. Blackwood," André said, his voice breaking now too, "on behalf of everyone here, on behalf of America, thank you. Thank you for what you did. Thank you for your sacrifice." But Zephyr shook his head. "I didn't make a sacrifice. I'm the one who survived. I'm the one still here while better men lie in the ground." "Survivor's guilt," Jessica whispered as she wrote. "He carries the burden of those he couldn't save." On stage, the orchestra members were also becoming emotional. Several of the older musicians had their own stories, parents who had lived through the war, grandparents who had died in concentration camps. A violinist, a man in his 60s, stood up and came forward. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, "my father fought too. He never talked about it like you, but I wish he had. I wish I could have told him it was okay to talk." Zephyr looked at the violinist and saw in him a younger version of his own never-born children. He had never married, never had children, afraid he would pass his trauma on to the next generation. "I'm sorry," Zephyr said, "for your father, for all the fathers who had to keep their pain silent." André knew this moment was a turning point. He could resume the show, continue the entertainment as if nothing had happened, or he could do something else. Something that might hurt his career, but was morally right. He turned to the orchestra. "We're going to play something," he said. "Something special for Zephyr Blackwood and all the veterans who are here or should be here." Sterling Vance grabbed his head backstage. This was a nightmare for production. Thousands of paying tickets, sponsors who needed to be satisfied, contractual obligations, but even he couldn't deny that what was happening on stage was bigger than business. André continued, "Tonight, I ask everyone here one thing. Go home tonight and ask yourself, what does freedom mean to me, and what am I willing to do to preserve it?" He looked at Zephyr. This man gave everything, his youth, his innocence, his friends, and he asks for nothing in return except that we don't forget. The audience now stood completely still, absorbing every word. "So I promise you, Mr. Blackwood," André said, "that we will not forget. Your story, your sacrifice, the price you paid, it will be remembered." He turned to the audience. "And all of you, you are now witnesses. You have met this man, heard his story. It is now your responsibility to pass it on." Zephyr tried to speak, but his voice failed him. Instead, he saluted, a simple military salute performed with trembling hands but perfect form. The entire Boston Common saluted back. Thousands of hands went to thousands of foreheads in a spontaneous tribute, and in that moment, André Rieu realized this was the most important performance of his career. Not because he had played, but because he had stopped playing. The days after the concert passed like a hurricane. The moment on stage had been filmed by hundreds of phones and had gone viral worldwide. Within 48 hours, the video had more than 80 million views, and Zephyr Blackwood had gone from a forgotten veteran to an international hero. But for Zephyr himself, little changed. He still sat in his small apartment in Boston, only now with stacks of letters from people around the world wanting to express their gratitude. "Grandpa," Lirelai said when she came to visit him, "have you seen what's happening? You're on every news channel. You're famous." Zephyr looked at the envelope in his hands, a letter from a school class in Japan wanting to know about his experiences. "It's too much," he mumbled. "I'm not a hero. I just did what had to be done." "But that's exactly why you're a hero," Lirelai said. "You did what had to be done without expecting recognition." There was a knock at the door. Lirelai opened it to find André Rieu, Jessica Morton, and a man in military uniform, a general from the U.S. Army. "Mr. Blackwood," the general said as he entered, "it's an honor to finally meet you." Zephyr tried to stand, but the general gestured for him to remain seated. "Please, stay seated. After what you've done, you deserve all the rest." The general pulled a box from his bag. "Mr. Blackwood, America regrets that it took so long to recognize you, but today I want to make that right." He opened the box and revealed a medal, the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration America could award. "In the name of the President and the American people," the general said formally, "you are hereby honored for exceptional courage and dedication during World War II." Zephyr stared at the medal, his hands trembling. "But I only did." "You did your duty when few dared," the general interrupted, "and the country is eternally grateful." He pinned the medal on Zephyr's chest. The old man touched it as if it weren't real. "There's more," André said, stepping forward. "I've spoken with the mayor, with veteran organizations, with schools across America. We're going to make sure your story and the stories of all your comrades are taught to every new generation." Jessica added, "And I'm writing a book about you, about all the veterans who have lived in silence, with your permission, of course." Zephyr looked around at the faces surrounding him, overwhelmed. Why? Why now, after all these years? Because, Liralee said softly, sometimes fate has a plan. Sometimes the right moment has to wait until the perfect moment. André nodded. That concert wasn't planned. Your appearance on stage wasn't planned, but it was exactly what the world needed to see. In the weeks that followed, Zephyr was invited to speak at schools, at veteran gatherings on Memorial Days. At first he refused, overwhelmed by the attention. But slowly, with Liralee's support, he began sharing his story. A month after the concert, he stood before a room full of high school students in Washington, D.C. They looked at him with wide eyes, this living link to a history they only knew from books. You might think war is heroic, he began, but it's not. It's terrible. It's watching friends die. It's making choices no one should ever have to make. A boy about 18 raised his hand. Mr. Blackwood, how did you go on after the war? How did you live with those memories? Zephyr was silent for a long moment. It was the question he had asked himself thousands of times. That's the point, he said finally. I didn't really live. I existed. I buried my emotions for 45 years, buried my memories. He looked around the room. If you learn one thing from me, let it be this. Process your trauma. Talk about it. Ask for help. Because a life in silence is no life. It's a slow death. The words affected not just the students, but Zephyr himself. For the first time in his life, he began to understand that his long years of silence had hurt him more than the war itself. 3 months after the concert, André Rieu returned to Boston for a special concert dedicated entirely to veterans and their families. Zephyr was seated in the front row with Liralee beside him, but this time it was different. This time he wasn't alone. Around him sat other veterans, men and women who had also lived in silence and were now finally getting a platform to share their stories. André began the concert with a speech. Tonight we don't play for entertainment. We play to honor, to remember, to heal. He looked at Zephyr. This man taught me that music is powerful, not because it makes us forget, but because it helps us remember in a way that's bearable. The concert began with the Star-Spangled Banner. But as the orchestra played, something remarkable happened. The veterans began to sing, not loudly or triumphantly, but softly and emotionally, their voices carrying the weight of years. Zephyr sang along, his hand in Liralee's, and for the first time, he felt that the music he had avoided for decades wasn't painful. It was healing. After the concert, André came to him. How do you feel? Lighter, Zephyr said honestly. For the first time in 75 years, I feel lighter. Good. Because I have one more surprise for you. He led Zephyr backstage where a group of people waited, old men and women, some with walkers, others in wheelchairs. Zephyr, André said, these are people who served with you. Your old unit. Zephyr looked around and recognized faces he hadn't seen in 75 years, men who had been boys when they fought together, now old men like him. Josiah, he whispered, staring at a man with a cane. Is that really you? It's me, old friend, Josiah said with tears in his eyes. I thought you were dead. I thought the same about you. They embraced. 2 old soldiers, finally reunited. Around them, similar reunions were happening. Men who had last seen each other in the mud of battlefields, now standing in the warmth of a concert hall. How did you find us all? Zephyr asked André. Veteran registries, social media, lots of phone calls, André said with a smile. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. That night, the old soldiers sat together, sharing stories they had kept silent for 75 years. They laughed about absurd moments, cried over lost friends, and finally found peace with their past. You know what the worst part was? Josiah said at one point. Not the war itself, but the silence afterward. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Everyone just wanted to move on. Others nodded in recognition. But now, Zephyr said, we can talk. Finally. 4 months after the original concert, the city of Boston organized an official memorial ceremony. Boston Common was full again, but this time not for entertainment, but for tribute. Zephyr stood on stage, no longer as a desperate old man, but as an honored veteran. Beside him stood his surviving comrades, each wearing their own medals and memories. The mayor spoke. For too long, we've taken our veterans for granted. For too long, we've forgotten the price they paid for our freedom. Today, that changes. He unveiled a monument, a bronze sculpture of a young soldier and an old veteran hand in hand. The plaque read, "For those who fought and those who remember." Zephyr touched the monument, his fingers tracing the lines of the young soldier's face. "This was me," he whispered. "So young, so unaware of what was coming." André stood beside him. "But look at who you became. Look at what you accomplished, not just in the war, but afterward. You learned how to share your story, how to heal." Zephyr nodded. "Thanks to you, if you hadn't stopped playing that night." "I stopped because it was the right thing to do," André interrupted. "And sometimes that's the hardest thing, doing what's right instead of what's easy." The ceremony ended with 2 minutes of silence. Thousands of people stood still, heads bowed, thinking of all the lives given for the freedom they now enjoyed. When the silence ended, the orchestra began playing. Not a triumphant march, but a soft, melancholic melody that spoke of loss and hope, of sorrow and healing. Zephyr listened with his eyes closed, and this time his tears weren't from pain, but from peace. Later that evening, he sat with Lirelai on his balcony, looking out over the lights of Boston. "Grandpa," she said, "are you glad you went to that concert?" Zephyr thought for a long time. "I was unhappy most of my life," he said honestly. "I thought I didn't deserve joy, didn't deserve recognition, but now I understand I wasn't doing it just for myself. I was doing it for all those who can't speak. Montgomery would be proud of you," Lirelai said softly. "I hope so. I hope they're all proud." He looked at his granddaughter. "Promise me something." "Anything, Grandpa. Tell my story to your children and their children. Make sure what we did, what we lost, is never forgotten." "I promise," Lirelai said, with tears in her eyes. A week later, Zephyr Blackwood died peacefully in his sleep. He was 100 years old and had finally found peace after 75 years of silence. His funeral was attended by thousands, veterans, students, ordinary citizens who had been touched by his story. André Rieu was there with the entire orchestra. They didn't play a cheerful waltz but a respectful requiem. "Zephyr Blackwood," André said during the service, "taught us that it's never too late to be heard. That a voice, even one that has been silent for 75 years, can still resonate across generations." He looked out over the crowd, and he taught us that freedom isn't just won on battlefields. It's preserved through memory, through recognition, through making sure the story is passed down. After the funeral, Lirelai approached André. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything you did for him." "I only did what was right," André replied. "Your grandfather did the rest." She handed him an envelope. "He wanted you to have this." André opened it and found a handwritten letter. "André, when I stepped onto your stage that night, I was planning to die. Not literally, but emotionally, to finally give in to the pain I had carried so long. But you stopped the music, you listened. And in that listening, you gave me back something I thought was lost forever. My dignity. I have peace now. Not because the memories are gone, but because they've finally been shared. Thank you for letting me speak. Thank you for letting me live. With deep gratitude, Zephyr." André folded the letter carefully and put it in his pocket. He would keep it forever, a reminder of the night he learned that sometimes stopping the music is more powerful than playing it. The story didn't end with Zephyr's death. His legacy lived on through the foundation established in his name, through the schools that now taught his story, through the veterans who found courage to speak because he had spoken first. The monument on Boston Common became a pilgrimage site for veterans and their families, a place where silence was finally broken and stories were finally told. Years later, when people asked André Rieu about the most memorable moment of his career, he always told the same story, about the night an old veteran stepped onto his stage and taught him what true courage was. Some heroes live their entire lives forgotten, he would say, until a simple gesture brings them back to history. And every time he performed on Boston Common, he took a moment to look at the monument. The young soldier and the old veteran, hand in hand, forever united in bronze and memory. In schools across America, children learned about Zephyr Blackwood, the forgotten veteran who reminded the world that freedom's price must never be forgotten. His story became part of the curriculum, ensuring that future generations would understand the sacrifice made for their liberty. The video of that magical night continued to be shared, watched by millions around the world. It became more than entertainment. It became education, inspiration, and a call to remember those who gave everything for freedom. Veterans who had lived in silence for decades found their voices, encouraged by Zephyr's example to share their stories before it was too late. André Rieu established an annual concert series called Remember the Heroes, where veterans were honored and their stories told alongside beautiful music. Each concert began with a moment of silence for those who could no longer speak, followed by music that celebrated both the sorrow of loss and the joy of freedom. Lyrelai kept her promise to her grandfather. She became a public speaker, sharing his story and the importance of listening to our elders before their voices are silenced forever. She worked with the Department of Veterans Affairs to create programs connecting young people with elderly veterans, ensuring that history lived through personal connection rather than just textbooks. The impact rippled far beyond America. Similar programs were established worldwide, recognizing that every nation has forgotten heroes whose stories deserve to be heard. André Rieu's simple act of stopping his concert had sparked a global movement of remembrance and recognition. In the end, Zephyr Blackwood's greatest victory wasn't on any battlefield. It was in that moment on stage when he chose to speak instead of remaining silent, to share instead of hiding, to trust that his pain had purpose. Through his courage to be vulnerable, he gave countless others permission to do the same, ensuring that the voices of the greatest generation would never truly be silenced.